We don't need to lean into these, do we? People will hear.
Okay, everybody. Okay. Firstly, thanks so much to everyone for coming. Students, public, local journalists. It's terrific to see you all here. We have a really superb panel today, and I know that's why you've all come. Away to my extreme left, don't usually position you there. Tim, it's Professor Tim Luckhurst from Kent University. Tim has had a very distinguished career in both broadcasting and print. He worked for many years for BBC. He was editor of the Scotsman, and he is now regularly, as I'm sure you're all aware, on BBC Radio, BBC Television, Sky News and Talk Sport. Yes, what? Do you have a football team, Tim?
Two, Richard. I support Partick Thistle, the only team in the Bible.
Yes, of course.
And Chelsea, which are not quite attractive.
Okay, excellent. Right, in the middle is Steve Fletcher. Steve is the acting editor of the Lincolnshire Echo, which, of course, famously went weekly only on Thursday. Steve has risen rapidly through the ranks, really. Nottingham Evening Post, where I was, of course, 1970s. Deputy editor there. Recently has taken up the acting editorship position over the road and has had all the problem of making it a weekly. I'm sure we're going to hear about that. And last but not least is Neil Fowler. Neil has edited 4 local newspapers, including the Lincolnshire Echo, one in Newcastle, the Western Mail. He's edited The Witch, the consumer magazine, and is now the Nuffield Fellow at the Oxford University. Actually, that's a Guardian position, investigating the future of local newspapers, so ideally suited to speak to our group. So let's welcome all 3. Right, the format is very simple. I'm going to ask them some brief questions, and what we really want to know is your comments and your questions. But just to get a sense of the audience, how many people bought the hard copy of the Lincolnshire Echo? Be honest. That's not bad, is it?
Thank you.
Right. How many people read it in its online formation? That's pretty good as well. Okay. Right. How many people in the room would more instinctively go to the online version of their favourite newspaper than the print? Yeah, just about everybody. Okay, right, we get the picture. Right, Steve, the Echo's gone weekly. Why?
I don't know if you're all aware that the Echo is owned by Northcliffe Media. Group based in London, has a number of regional titles around the country. Locally around here, they own, as well as the big papers in Derby, Leicester and Nottingham, they've got Grimsby and Scunthorpe and the whole Daily Mail. They've had a big review of all their operations this year and what they're going to do going forward. And they looked at, all the papers have had declines in revenue, advertising revenue, and in readership over the years. And they looked at where we'd be in a couple of years' time. And the harsh reality was that there wouldn't be an Echo, a daily Echo, in a couple of years' time, if we carried on as we were. That's not to blame anyone, that's just the way the trend of the business has been going. So they looked at the figures, and the decision was taken, while we're in a position of strength, to go to weekly now. Northcliffe's had 3 papers that have already gone from daily to weekly in Exeter, Scunthorpe and Torquay. They've all gone in the last 6 months. And they looked at the figures for Lincoln, and the ABC figure, which is the readership figure that we're judged on was one of the best in Northcliffe. But at around 17,000 readers of the daily edition a day, they decided that we wouldn't be making enough profit, or in a couple of years a profit at all, and that to ensure the sustainability going forward, we'd go weekly.
Okay, that's clear. So coming in, Tim, that's a Lincoln perspective, but the national perspective is similarly papers going weekly, closing down, jobs are being lost. Why is this?
Well, the regional and local newspapers have been in decline, Richard, since essentially the Second World War, and in steep decline in recent years. The major decline in recent years is for a new economic reason. It is, as you say, the challenge of the internet, the challenge of multimedia convergence. I am not hugely optimistic about the future of local newspaper companies. I think that the big groups that own, and I will be corrected by Neil if I'm wrong about this, about 67% of our local and regional newspapers are owned by four major groups: Trinity Mirror, Johnson Press, Northcliffe and NewsQuest. I don't think that those big groups will continue to be heavily involved in local newspapers in future, because they simply won't return the profit margins that they require. But I'm not pessimistic about the future of local journalism, in the sense that I think that it can be done more economically, more effectively, and that it can maintain its role of scrutinising power and holding local authority and local power to account by doing it online and by doing it with new economic models. I think the future is very much new economic models based around the internet and around the readership of newspapers online, that they will be funded by a combination of advertising and philanthropy. And I suspect that there will be a niche role for newspapers, but they'll be very, very upmarket, they'll be very expensive, and they'll be for niche readerships. That's my starting point.
You've covered a lot there. That's really terrific. Neil, you've been doing your year-long research into the whole situation of local media. What have you found out in a brief few minutes?
Well, I've been looking at it from a historical perspective on why we've got to where we are.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of criticism over sort of the big companies who've been seen to have taken too much money out, gone for excessive profits. I think that broadly most people are saying that even if they hadn't taken those big profits, and it's interesting looking at in Tim's locality of the Kent Messenger Group, which is a local company, family owned, which wasn't making large margins. As soon as the change came in the mid-2000s, it plunged straight into loss making. Whereas those companies that were earning bigger money didn't go into loss making positions straight away. So those sort of things have not helped the image of the industry. But what I have found is that, as Tim says, I wouldn't say the decline since the end of the Second World War, but broadly, readership has been down since the early 60s. Sales and regional dailies have been down since the late 70s, at the time when local weeklies have stood up. And of course, all this has been masked by the growth of the classified advertising from the early 1960s.
Am I right in thinking that there were more closures of local morning newspapers in the late 90s and 40s and early 1950s than in the period after that? Those sort of papers were probably losing money before the end of the Second World War anyway. The whole lost
market.
out after the birth of radio and TV.
Rather than get into a big debate, but most second city regional evening papers had gone before Radio Leicester started in 1967. For example. But sorry, so
Go for it.
a whole lot of things had been going on. Sociological change, time poverty was already in place in the 60s. But the growth of classified advertising, newspapers had not made much money before the 70s. Classified advertising came in, brought in from North America by Lord Thompson. That then masked, because the growth was very high, very progressive. at the same time, sales gently declining, and especially on regional dailies. And I think in this debate we've got to differentiate between regional dailies and locals, because if we're at a cliff edge, then clearly some regional daily newspapers are looking over the edge of the cliff edge.
Right.
The broadsheet newspapers, the Times, the Guardian and the Independent, are alongside those regional dailies, looking over the cliff edge in terms of financial security going forward. Behind them you've got the mid-markets, the tabloids, you've got magazines, and you've got local weeklies. I think a fair way from that cliff edge, because broadly there's a level of advertising, and as journalists we don't like accepting the fact, but for 200 years the provision of news in the UK has been subsidised by advertising, and that business model changed 10 years ago, and we've yet to find the new business model that takes us forward. The business model exists still for small local weekly newspapers. Tyndall Newspapers owns 200 very small titles, very staffed very tightly, selling a few thousand, but there's a level of advertising there that comes in that will not be reached on the internet. If you're in Chippenham or Small Warminster or whatever, if you put in Warminster Carpenter, you'll get the first 2 pages of Google will be Yell or aggregators. You won't find the Small Warminster Carpenter you're looking for. If you go to the Warminster paper, he or she will be advertising in there. Now, other newspapers, groups, the big ones, are getting more aggressive on cover pricing. And again, one of the historical factors we've faced is that after the war, there was an opportunity to increase the price of newspapers. But the decision was made that newspapers should be cheap. And newspapers, even now, are still cheap. It's an often used metaphor, but for a quarter of the price of a Starbucks cup of coffee, you can get your local regional daily newspaper. It's great to see the Echo has gone for £1. In the United States, 2 newspapers, the Dallas Morning News and the Boston Globe, have upped the cover price of their home delivered copies from $200 a year to $500 a year. Which means that when you buy that newspaper, you are covering the cost of that newspaper with the cover price you're paying. It's a realistic view at what news is costing. More news organisations in the States are going towards charging for some form of news coverage. They appreciate that news costs money. In the UK, we're still in this big debate over free versus paid for. Long term, if we don't find a way of paying for news, for quality news, we'll get into the cases of hobby journalism, part-time journalism, and the professional journalism that the country needs will not be paid for, and that's where the big issue really arises.
Thank you. Now, Steve, it's quite a lot of money, £1, for a local paper. Did you think of what went behind that choice of the price, and is it likely to go free sometime in the future, do you think?
I mean, it is a lot, based on the historical context that Neil's talking about, but it's still only £1, and it's last week's, for example, 192 pages, and in there you had all your news, your features, your sport, but you had your jobs, property, motor supplements. It's a lot, and I don't think many people in this room, if you're into newspapers and you like newspapers, will disagree. £1 isn't a lot for what we give to people. Whether it will go free in the future, I'm not 100%. I'm not sure about. No. There's been so many changes in the last 10 years that I can't predict what the market will be like in 5 or 10 years' time. But I still think it's good value what we're giving people at the moment.
Tim, is free the future?
No, I don't think free can be the future, because I'm intrigued to look at the number of you put up your hands and said that you prefer to read the local newspaper or presumably your national newspaper free online. But surely you're aware that the only reason that online content exists is that professional journalists who are being paid salaries, because believe it or not, journalists have wives and families, or husbands and families, or boyfriends or girlfriends and children and mortgages and things, and actually need to earn money. These are professional people. Those people are only producing the copy you're reading online because at the moment someone publishing the print edition is paying them, and enough people just are buying the print edition. If the print editions die on the current economic models, the online editions will die too. You won't have your free newspaper copy, you won't have your Guardian Unlimited, you won't have your Independent Online, you won't have your Telegraph.co.uk, because they are being subsidised by the printed edition. And the thing that I find really terrifying about the future of newspapers as they currently appear in this country is that we haven't tried democracy in this country without diverse, plural, local and national newspapers. We simply haven't given it a go. The idea that you could have a parliamentary system, a representative democracy, without professional news gathering, without objective reporters providing a real service to their communities, is something that I find very, very difficult to contend with. And I'm extremely concerned about the notion that there is such a thing as a citizen journalist that can replace the professional. I don't call them citizen journalists. I think it's an oxymoron. I think they're citizens who can talk to each other horizontally and use the internet to communicate with each other, and that's absolutely fantastic. But the notion that such people are journalists, that they're professionals, is just preposterous. Unless you can do 120 words per minute shorthand, unless you know the law, unless you have done and understand public affairs, unless you have a grasp of history and context, as far as I'm concerned, you're not a journalist. And we need those people. We need them desperately, and we need people to pay for them. So will they be free? No, Richard, you can't have free journalists. Journalists are professionals, and they aren't free.
Excellent. Yeah, because on that point, my question in all these is, going forward, who is going to cover Hartlepool magistrates on a wet Wednesday afternoon? And to my mind, that is the principal question that all of us should be facing, that in this summer, where the activities of a few journalists on the News of the World have dominated the headlines and unfortunately are dominating the direction in which media debate is taking place in this country, is, I think, completely misguided, because the real issues that all journalists and all those interested in news should be facing are is the provision of how general news is going to be provided in the future and how it's going to be funded in the future. Not commoditised news, not specialised news, because I think organisations like the Financial Times have shown that you can commoditise certain aspects of news and you can get businesses to pay for it. It's the provision of general news, i.e. the question of who covers Hartlepool magistrates on a wet Wednesday afternoon. And also the second one, that is the engagement of people in the news media, because I think as newspaper sales decline and newspaper readership declines, and also as TV news viewing declines, a big debate. I remember a huge debate over how wonderful the Sky News reporter had been in getting into one part of Tripoli early on. She was watched by 167,000 people out of 60 million people in the UK. No one watches Sky News. Very few people watch BBC.
It's great. That broadcast was watched by nearly 400,000 people. It was the biggest people in Sky's ever achieved.
Indeed, yeah.
And if the BBC had had the good sense to buy that film and to show it would have been watched by 10 million.
And it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube.
But again, on the news engagement, BBC News gets watched between 5 and 10 million times. If it's lucky, fewer than 200,000 people watch all 5 editions of the 10 o'clock news on the BBC each night. That is, I think, the lack of news engagement. We talked about Free there. I think one of the issues facing Free is that, as those of us who worked in newspapers for many years know, up until now, newsprint, after salaries, which is the second biggest cost in newspapers, newsprint has been pretty cyclical, as has been up, boom and bust, it's gone up and down. Newsprint is now on the up and will stay on the up, because newsprint is a global commodity. There are ships on the high seas that will turn around if a better price is found for their loads, and generally the better price is found in India and China. So it's gone up by 35% in the last year, 15 months, so it won't come back down again. So I think the debate is not necessarily about free versus paid for. It could well be paid for versus pick-up, and I think pick-up is going to be the next big debate on how newspapers go forward.
Right. By the way, is anyone from Hartlepool in this? No? Okay. Let's throw it out.
Are you frightened to admit it just because Peter Mandelson once represented the constituency?
Yes. Okay. Comments or questions? Say who you are when you ask the question. So who's going to start us? Yes.
Mike Ambrose, 40 years in the trade, but I've gone straight. At the moment, there's a lot of movement with social networking, and there's the National Union of Journalists this weekend got a conference in Cardiff where they'll be discussing the cross-fertilisation of local newspapers with the social network. How do you see those two working together, or how they relate?
Let's work down this way, Tim.
I think that one has to draw a very clear distinction between the enormous success of social networking as a means of horizontal collaboration between citizens and its usefulness to journalists. It has clear usefulness to journalists, but that usefulness is not in the form of citizen journalism as classically described. Rather, it's in the form of what is in fact a traditional relationship. Citizens sending ideas for stories, pictures of stories, sound, video, to newspaper, television, broadcast, multimedia newsrooms, and having that material curated by professional journalists, i.e. the curatorial role of the journalist has developed in partnership with the provision of social media. Now, I think that's fantastic. I think that the ability of citizens to send material to professional newsrooms and for those newsrooms to assess its accuracy and to make use of it in properly edited, considered journalism is enormously valuable. But I don't think it's the salvation for journalism, because I don't think most citizens have enough time to spend their lives providing that service. It's useful, but it's a marginal usefulness. And in a way, it's a bit of a red herring. People say to me, social media is a huge phenomenon. They're absolutely right. It is a huge phenomenon. But the fact that it's a huge phenomenon by which people speak to each other about issues which concern them does not mean that it has any direct intrinsic value to journalism beyond the curatorial role that I've described.
Thank you. I mean, two bits there. I mean, first of all, whether citizens have the time and the inclination to provide us with stories. They do it unwittingly. They do it, you know, we just have to, as journalists and as newspapers, have to be, you know, following the right person on Twitter, looking at the right sites on Facebook. People are doing it without realising they're doing it. It might be, a few months ago at Nottingham, when I was working there, we had a front page lead about one of their strikers who had a crash on the M1 at 100 miles an hour, and he put that on there. He didn't want it to go in the newspapers, and when we approached him, he said, "What are you doing? How come you've got this?" But that is a great way to get a story, and he didn't mean that at all. So I think people are doing this unwittingly anyway. But then you look at how we as newspapers can use social media to our advantage. And we can, our reporters are encouraged to tweet about big stories that they've got coming up. Our Lincoln City reporter is encouraged, he debates with fans all the time, various stories that are coming up and gives his views on them and encourages people to buy the printed product.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of evidence, I should have said that actually, let me just add. There's a huge amount of evidence that people use social networks as a way to find their way back to quality edited journalism. People go from Facebook, from Twitter to the BBC News website, or from Facebook or Twitter to the Lincolnshire Echo, to This is Lincolnshire. Yeah. Of course they do. But again, it's about a curatorial relationship. It isn't essentially about the provision of stories, except in the way that you described, the tip-off. That wasn't intended. Yeah.
But I think the conference at the weekend that you were talking about was that aspect of it, wasn't it? Was how journalists can use it better to get people back reading their work in print.
Yes, it's a tool, and I think which journalists should be using. But I think in how it's all developing, I think the interesting is the growth of the app and the tablet, and that's something in new technology which could be the saviour, or could be something that will help keep news involved, because people see apps, they're happy to pay for apps. They may not be happy to pay for news online from a website, but they seem to be willing to pay for an app because they appreciate they're receiving an edited product. That and even now, with the growth of the internet, everybody still needs an editor, small lowercase e, to guide them through their day, because they've got a limited amount of time. Information is being thrown at them. They still need those choices, and a Google search engine may not be good enough to give them the right choices. So you need an editor to say, this is what I believe, as we have now, we have done for 200 years, these are the top 10, 15, 20 stories I believe you should be reading today, whether it's in Lincoln or nationally or worldwide at all. So social media is just almost a byproduct, and it's very important, I think, as an industry, we don't get sidetracked by the growth of it. Because again, I'll come back to my point again. Who is going to tweet from Hartlepool magistrates on a Wednesday afternoon? No one, to my knowledge, unless they're being paid to do it.
Okay. Thank you. Another question, comment. Yes.
Jack Dawson-Smith, Virgin Journalism. If all of if the majority of the publications are in the hands of for-profit companies, perhaps it's the profit margin that is also an issue in journalism today. Would it be an idea to lobby the government to provide funding for not-for-profit publications?
Right, I'm going to take that. It will be an absolute calamity. We have not attempted democracy in this country with state-owned or state-regulated newspapers. We do not want the state to be involved. And far from being a problem for journalism, if you understand, as I think all journalism should, the history of the profession, you'll understand that it was actually profit that liberated newspapers from control by political parties, from control by subsidy. And that in order to be the independent scrutineers of power that they have been for 200 years, or well, actually since about 1855, since the abolition of stamp duty, newspapers need to make sufficient profits to be able to stand independently of government at any level, and in order to be able to confront and face down bullying companies and organisations which seek to sue them or to persecute them via the law. So I'm afraid I don't think profit is a threat to journalism. I think it is the essential guarantor of journalism's liberty and independence. Whether the margins should be as great as they have been in the past, I don't think there's any option. They won't be. But I think it's crucially important that newspapers should be privately owned and that all local news, and ideally, in my opinion, all except the BBC, should be in private hands. I hope that those private hands can be smaller than the large companies. That's my only comment.
Thank you, Tim.
Yes, I agree. You can't have any state subsidy of news whatsoever. But at the same time, I think there are grounds for looking at whether you could have a new form of charitable status for news organisations, and which is something different, where they have some form of tax advantage. But Reuters Institute for Study of Journalism in Oxford has done a fair amount of work, and if there is one company in the UK, the Maidenhead Advertiser, there's a very successful weekly newspaper that's been owned by the Baylis Trust for the past 49 years, since 1962, I think it's 49. There, the newspaper's profits are covenanted to the Baylis Trust that distributes them locally to charitable good causes in the local region. Now, that's not a straight charity, but locally people appreciate that when they pay their 50 pence or 55 pence to Maidenhead Advertiser each week, those profits end up in the local charity, in the local community. There have got to be new ways of looking for of organisations being set up. Johnson Press, whose shares were 6.25 are now 4 1/8 pence, I think. They're stuck in this no man's land where they're almost, in the words of the bank, they're almost too big to go bust because they owe so much money. Someone has to find a way of there being, in the words of our bankers, an orderly default on those debts, so that a company whose market capitalisation is now £30 million, and Tim, being a former editor of the Scotsman, I'm sure would think that the Scotsman itself, to Scottish business and Scottish customers, is worth more than £30 million in its own right.
When I was editor, it was sold for $195 million.
Indeed. so that shows how ridiculous the debt burden on Johnson's, which has happened in many ways by the management's own fault, but in the same time, no management saw, rightly or wrongly, the way the industry was going to shift gear so rapidly that revenues declined by 40% in a matter of 3 years, and those revenues no one sees, even if there is an economic upturn, no one sees those revenues going up by more than 10%. We've got to find new ways of setting businesses up. The government has a big role to play in this. We've just seen in Kent, where the Kent Messenger was looking to take over 7 second and third marketplace newspapers from Northcliffe newspapers. They were turned down by the OFT. It was too expensive for the Kent Messenger Group to take go to the Competition Commission. It's a very expensive process to go through. In the end, those 7 newspapers will probably be closed down, I think, and they will go. And the end result will be worse than if they're being allowed to be taken over.
So liberalise cross-media regulation.
Indeed, yeah. It's going to be liberalised in a big way. And this argument that there needs to be plurality of newsprint in every marketplace, I'm afraid, doesn't hold water anymore. In most marketplaces, there is not enough advertising and circulation revenue to support two newspapers, and the view that editors like myself and Tim and Steve have had MDs and CEOs on the phone to us every day of the week telling us what to put in our newspapers has just never happened. And it's an argument that has been made probably since before the war, goes back to Beaverbrook. It's years out of date and has got to be modified by the government. And the government have got to take a lead role in saying if they want newspapers to survive, they've got to put the political measures in place to allow them to survive.
I might add to that we have plurality in most of our local and regional journalism because we have an organisation called the BBC, which I revere and which I think is a great British institution. I hope it continues to thrive. I would fund it better than the current government is prepared to permit it being funded. But we have plurality as long as we have the BBC there as the backstop against which local newspapers provide the diversity.
Thank you. Question or comment? Is that one there? Go for it.
Hi, I'm Lee Soon, first year PhD student. I got a question. Facing the fierce competition of new media and other competitive media organization of national level, what do you think is the best strategy to for the local news, for the local newspaper to survive?
Okay. So. Go for it. What's behind your strategy? When you launched the weekly, what did you think of your audience? How did you pitch it to your audience?
Well, we had to look at the fact that we couldn't carry on as we were because, like you said, because of the rise of other media, local and on the internet and national, something had to be done. And we couldn't continue as we were, so we decided that having everything in one paper once a week was the best way to appeal to advertisers, which is crucial because we need the revenues, and to give those advertisers more readers. Fewer people than ever are reading the paper 6 nights a week. People don't seem to have the time to read it or the inclination to read one paper 6 nights a week. And so we thought we'd give them everything all in one go. So we've got people who might only buy it for motors, they might only buy it for property or for jobs. We give them one paper with everything in. And then you're looking at how to pitch it. Well, there are certain things in the paper that are very, very popular, and we kept all them. But then we decided that...
What's the most popular?
Well, it is the news. It is the holding people to account. We made sure that we didn't lose any news writers, any news reporters. We had to keep them. Because they're the ones who locally hold people to account. They're the ones who trawl through the council agendas and through the court lists to find the best good team that we have here. Feature writing as well. So we made sure we keep our entertainments guide because that's very popular and it has been over a number of years. But then we thought we'd try and introduce more contributors into the paper so that we're representing everyone across the community and giving more people a voice. So if you look through last week's paper, there were a lot more first-person pieces, and that's something we've tried to introduce. So whether it was Fred Downey's allotment talking or the Chief Constable, there were a lot more first-person pieces in there.
That's very nice.
Yeah, so we've kept all that. The sport, as well as Lincoln City, a lot of the local grassroots sport has all been kept in. Locally, the nostalgia section has always been, the way we were as it was, has always been very popular. So we're looking at how we can change that and keep improving. And it's all about keeping improving and trying not to lose touch with the readers and giving them what they want. And you can't be all things to all people, but we think we've got the right balance at the moment.
Tim, what do you see as a model of a good newspaper that's got a future?
Well, I wouldn't just call it a newspaper, Richard. If I could start a media company from scratch nowadays, I would combine local brand names, which are usually brand names which date from before the combination of most of our local titles into big groups. So a local brand name like the Kent Messenger Group. And I would produce a combination of hyper-local websites staffed by extraordinarily talented beat reporters working to cover their very, very local community and working predominantly to cover it for an online outlet. I would link all of those local, hyper-local sites together to create one weekly newspaper covering a regional area. So I'd have hyper-local journalists covering Kent at a very local level. I would have a weekly edition, rather like the Lincolnshire Echo, to cover the county. And I would then look to see whether there was a possibility of partnering that with broadcast video and audio coverage, if it were possible. I would also try to work in partnership with a university. If I were in Lincoln, for example, I would look at the wonderful radio and television studios in the School of Journalism here at Lincoln and say, if this were the United States, these would be being used day in, day out to produce local news in partnership with a commercial company. In Kent, I'm very keen to do the same thing with mine. So hyper-local, niche weekly print, and partnership with the academic and voluntary sector. And all of that requires the relaxation of the cross-media rules, as we've discussed. Also perhaps involves some bonus, some tax benefit to universities and other partners to encourage them to get into public-private partnerships with local commercial media companies. That's how I'd do it. Would it work? Well, I'd invest in it, put it like that.
Okay. How about you? Would you invest in it? Yeah.
I think very much so. I think in discussing the last question on the big groups, I think there's got to be a way found of local people coming back into ownership of local newspapers. Now, some of the local groups exist, CN Group in Cumbria, Barnsley Chronicle, all pretty successful, but and Kent Messenger Group. But again, they've had their issues in that with the Kent Messenger, when they had to lose 350 jobs the other year, the owners of that newspaper do walk down the same streets as the people they've just had to sack for sadly sound economic reasons. And the KM was a well-run group, didn't make large profits, but were just hit by this sudden change that they didn't see coming. But you then get local accountability. You've got to find ways of getting local groups coming back, local entrepreneurs, in the same way that Lincoln City and clubs like probably the other 70 football clubs outside the Premiership have been owned by local businesses because it's good for that city or town to have a local football club. I think you're going to get people come together. It is good, and they'll know the sound reasons that there should be a good local or regional newspaper in that area, keeping authorities, keeping the courts, keeping the city the councils under scrutiny. So I want to see that sort of thing happening. Like Tim, it's got to be multimedia. The ownership rules have got to be changed dramatically. The tax rules have got to be changed because it is right that there is scrutiny of the authorities. At present, the newspapers that are closed in the UK have been second or third in their marketplaces. Nowhere has no region or no main region has got is bereft of a scrutiny organisation like a newspaper. That may happen soon. This is why the government has got to stop fiddling about with things like local TV that are only 55, 60 years out of date and past their subject. They've got to look at funding the existing models of making sure that scrutiny can carry on for the future.
Thank you. Another question or comment? Yes.
I'm Daniel, I'm a first year journalism student.
Great.
I live in Cambridge actually, but I'm not here, and I'm reading local newspapers, still running 6 days a week. I have two questions for you. First of all, what do you think is the secret to success of these sorts of papers? And secondly, would you say that the decline is in these sort of regional dailies is confined to smaller areas?
Okay, go for it.
Well, Cambridge is interesting because Cambridge Evening News is owned by the ILF Group. An ILF Group has 4 divisions. There's a news division. There's a marinas division. I think ILF is also the biggest provider of Christmas trees in the country. It owns a lot of land and has a property company in Canada. It's diversified. So it doesn't need to make vast sums of money on its newspapers to carry on. It also is very local, it's very focused. It can have a low cost base, and in a place like Cambridge, it's a good. There's a huge community feel to the place. I know there's a town and gown element, but it's a good basis there, and that diversification, they can get their costs down. A company like Iliff has a printing press in Cambridge still, but it's working 24 hours a day. For example, I think from this week it's printing the Leicester Mercury as well. If you have a printing press, you've got to make sure it's working 24 hours a day. If not, get rid of it and get your newspaper printed elsewhere. The newspaper industry took many, many years to reach maturity on the sharing of resources. Especially when Tim and I were new to the game, every newspaper would have had its own printing press that would have operated for 2 or 3 hours a day. Other 20-odd hours didn't operate, and a big cost there. When I was editing either Lincoln or Derby, I remember in the Northcliffe group we had got wind that the Cardiff Centre was about to invest in a colour press, so we moved heaven and earth to get a colour press into Swansea before Cardiff got theirs, rather than thinking perhaps if Cardiff got this new colour press they could print us as well, lower our costs. We didn't do it that way. We've now paid the price. One of the benefits of having Rupert Murdoch investing £650 million in huge presses for the Sun and the Times means that during the daytime they can print a lot of local newspapers very cheaply, much more cheaply than those local papers can print themselves. So the area of the super print centre is very important. So for someone like Cambridge, diversify, accept that your profit margins aren't going to be as great as before, and get your costs down as low as possible. Outsource as much as you can. Concentrate on local reporters and local ad reps to make your product work.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Yes.
Hi, Mark Davis, first year student in journalism. With increased accusations of journalism and more stories being given to the newspapers through PR companies, and the old school reporting methods becoming more and more extinct, what words of reassurance and encouragement can you offer the students that is not happening?
Right, journalism, go for it. How does it impact on local press?
Journalism has had a much greater impact on the local press than it's had on the national press. And the simple reason for that is that local
Do you want to explain what journalism is, maybe?
Yes, journalism literally means people who are employed as journalists sitting at their desks, churning out story after story after story, which contain no or very little original journalism. Essentially, they are turning around press releases sent to them in many cases by celebrity press agents, by public relations companies. And it leads to a reality in which thousands and thousands of newspapers around the world can, on the same day, publish the same story with very little difference in the way it's written. But I must stress that this is not the entirety of output of local newspapers. Good local newspapers do exactly what is being described tonight. They retain their news reporters as their most important asset. They have stripped out virtually every other aspect of what they do, and they have kept the ability to gather and to report original news. Why? Because people like original news. People want to read about what their neighbours are doing. They want to read about what's going on in their community. They want to read about local politicians, local schools, local hospitals and local businesses. And you need original reporters to do that. The fundamental job of a journalist is to go and find something out, ideally something that somebody doesn't want them to find out, and then to then tell the public about it. And although journalism has damaged that, Nick Davis's recent and very successful book rather overstated the extent to which this is happening in newsrooms, and rather exaggerated the extent to which local newspapers want to do it. They don't want to do it, they want to do original reporting because they know it works very well. But I return to the point I made at the beginning of this. It costs money. So if all of you care about journalism, go and buy a newspaper. You'll be making sure that it continues to exist.
Thank you, Tim. Yes.
I mean, on a local level, and the actual reality is that over the last decade, etc., the big four newspaper groups have been, there's been so much cost cutting that journalists and newspapers have had to turn around 6-day-a-week newspapers on increasingly limited resources. And I think that has given rise to the journalism. That there's fewer people trying to do more and more. And the inevitable consequence of that has been that you have been sat round at times just rewriting press releases and getting them through. That's why we have to look again at how we do everything in this industry. And so at the Echo, to put out the Daily Echo 6 nights a week has been a hard slog for quite a while. And trying to create something that people go wow about every week, every day, hard work, very hard work, and probably didn't have the resources to do it every night brilliantly. So what we can do now at Lincolnshire by going weekly is reassess how we do everything, so we can treat the news differently, try and get the stories behind the stories. Yes, we haven't got a paper every night of the week, but the journalists now should be finding that they have the time to do the stories better and to go away from journalism.
Roughly how much of the time of your news reporters is spent in the office compared to being out there? Roughly 20%, 40%?
As a weekly or a daily?
No, as now.
Well, because we've only been doing it.
As a daily.
As a daily, I mean, the majority of the time was spent in the office. I'd love to sit here and say, 80% of the time they're out finding stories, digging, and then coming back, writing them up quickly, and out they go again. That's not the reality, but hopefully with the new system, that they will have more time to be out there.
I can illustrate from my experience the extent to which that is a question of resources. When I was at the Scotsman, Scotland's national newspaper, we had 46 reporters on staff at the time, and we started. 32 of them would be on shift every day, and I used to scream at the news editor if any more than 4 of them were in the newsroom at 7 o'clock in the morning, because if they were working, they were ready to be out on the story. All I wanted them to do was phone the news editor and tell him what they were doing, or listen to what he had to say in response to their suggestion. I didn't want them in the newsroom. When you haven't got enough reporters, they all come into the newsroom just to fill the pages. That's what cutting the budgets of newspapers does. And again, that's why I say buy them, please, thanks.
What was the gender thing there at the Scotsman, male, female, in your reporting stuff? Do you remember?
I remember that I was appalled when I arrived that it was more male dominated than the BBC, where I'd spent the first 15 years of my career, Richard. By the time that I left, our news desk was almost 50% female. It should have been more than 50% female. But our foreign desk, I was delighted to say, was the first foreign desk. By the time we'd appointed 15 full-time foreign correspondents, we had 8 of them who were women, and I was very proud of that.
Okay.
I think on this question, there's also a need to appreciate what local and regional newspapers, what their readers are actually looking for. I think one of the sins of the last 25 years or so in regional daily newspapers in particular is that they've tried to ape their tabloid colleagues in London too much, and they've gone away from reporting local names, faces and whatever, which might be dull. People might in London might think it's quite funny, but what sells local newspapers even now is local names, local faces. A lot of those stories might be a bit dull. You won't win Pulitzer Prizes through doing a good local newspaper, but that's where local weeklies, hopefully papers like Lincoln, will emulate papers like what the Kent Messenger have done over many, many years, the Cornishman, West Britain. A lot of great weekly newspapers have concentrated on filling local names and local faces. And so there's not a need and desire to have great exclusive stories, great investigative journalism tracks in local newspapers and regional papers. It's about producing newspapers that people want to read and are going to get something out of. Many years ago when I was a young reporter, and those who training at Lincoln may or may not be surprised to know that my first news editor is in the audience tonight. And one of the things he sent me out on, and there were 2 reporters, and Roger, you'll remember this, there were 2 of us, young reporters, we were sent out to cover half of Leicester each. I think on the west side, another reporter on the east side. And we upset our colleagues greatly because we were just sent out to find stories. We'd go out all day and we'd come back with 20, 25 memos, which would then hand out to other reporters the day after. We were finding local names and local faces that filled the Leicester Mercury. It may not look pretty For example, the Wolverhampton Express and Star these days doesn't look pretty, but over the last 30 years it has outperformed the Birmingham Mail by twice. And that is just a paper that journalists claim to hate because it looks horrible. But it's full of local stories that local people in Wolverhampton want to read. And I don't suppose the Express and Star breaks many so-called exclusives. It may not invest in investigative journalism, but it's the best-selling regional evening newspaper in this country.
Just what you were saying there about local names and local people in the paper. Since we launched the weekly last Thursday, one of the biggest bits of feedback we've had is from people saying we love the courts pages, which is just listing everyone who's at magistrates and what they've done and this is something papers used to do decades ago and we all went away from. And now more and more they're coming back to it, and people are saying, oh look, Billy down our street is being in court again. And people want it. Stay out of that.
I don't know if any of you ever go to France, but I spend a lot of time in France and in Brittany, and the most successful newspaper in France is a newspaper called West France, which is the Breton paper. And it has a reporter in every village. It does a different edition for every village. So I have a home in a village called Plouguenau. There's a woman who covers Plouguenau who will get the names of every business, every teacher, every doctor, every councillor in Plouguenau into that paper at least once every 6 months. And it is a fantastically successful product and something that you just desperately want to read, because you know that if your next door neighbour has crashed his car into the fish factory at the end of the street, it will be in there and you'll know how much he had to drink.
France is interesting. Sarkozy gave to every sixth former, as you noted, the money to subscribe to a national newspaper as a way of boosting circulation. It's an interesting intervention by the state.
It is, sure, but sadly Monsieur Sarkozy's friends own several of those newspapers, Richard. And I'm not entirely sure his motives were pure.
But on an English, where would that be an interesting solution?
French national papers and British national papers simply don't bear comparison, because the French regional press has always outsold the French national press by a very high margin. And indeed, the French regional press doesn't need subsidy because it is successful in that way. But I give it to my original point. I believe that the moment the state starts to subsidise journalism is the moment when the state starts to control journalism, and that is the moment when our democracy is imperilled. No, philanthropy, yes. Tax breaks, yes. State subsidy, never.
Okay, that's clear. Comment, question? Yes. Yes.
Sam Harvey, journalist. Just looking at the aspects of legal, obviously we've got the whole view of the libel laws going through at the moment, but you're talking about not charitable trusts or not-for-profit trusts running local papers. How do you see that against the powers and the libel laws? In fact, you've got some very strong people out there, particularly local businessmen, even councils now, which are using the law to stifle the press. I know we've got a big capacity of thinking about counter that, but what happens when we get to not-for-profit small groups against these sort of huge corporate...
Well, not-for-profit doesn't mean not efficient and not run properly. Not-for-profit just means, and there are plenty of organisations that for example, theatre trusts. Well, I think this university is a charity that is not-for-profit. I suspect I think universities... But even you get the same. No, A, you need insurance, and B, you've got to be very careful, and that happens. So, I have a little magazine here that circulates in Northampton called the Linc, full of local advertising.
The Linc?
Yep, it's L-I-N-K.
Right.
But that is
the local newspaper here at the university is the Linc.
But this is one of the potential views, because there'll be magazines like this all around the country full of local advertising. Now, if they get something wrong, they could well get sued as well. Some of the most notorious court cases in this country have been on low circulation news magazines. But not-for-profit doesn't mean inefficient, doesn't mean not effective. They've got to be professional about what they do. And arguably, the worst libels, the worst breaches of the law you see every day are on the internet through people passing comments on unregulated, unmonitored news sites that make up facts, make up comments about people that are clearly libelous, and one of these days someone is going to pay a lot of money for that.
But you make a crucially important point. It is vital that professional journalism is produced by organisations which have pockets deep enough to stand up to powerful enemies. But I am not quite as pessimistic as you are. At the moment we have regional and local newspaper groups which clearly cannot do that. Part of the reason for that is that they are impoverished and unwilling to take the risks. Part of the reason is that we need desperately to reform our libel laws, and fortunately that is happening and appears to be happening in a direction which is in the interests of securing a genuine free opportunity and potentially also a public interest defence for genuinely well-intentioned investigative journalism. I think it's crucial that we achieve that reform. I'd also go further and say I would like to see a public interest defence for some of the techniques which have recently become controversial. Will never defend anybody for hacking a celebrity's phone or for hacking Millie Dowler's phone, but I'm wholeheartedly behind David Lee of The Guardian, who revealed that he had hacked a telephone in order to reveal the activities of a fraudulent and dishonest arms dealer. I think there should be a public interest defence for doing that.
Good. Okay, we're coming to the end. So the last go-round is colleagues, think 5 years in the future. What would you like to see the position of local newspapers, starting with Steve?
What I'd like to see it is the newspaper groups investing in editorial departments again, investing in the newspapers again, because there's there could be a great future. There's been so much cost cutting in the last 5 or 10 years that some newspaper groups are going to be fatally undermined by it. But if there was investment in them, then I think the future could be very, very good. We need journalists. We need properly qualified journalists, hard-working journalists, not just someone who sets up their own website and calls himself a journalist. But to do that, we need investment. I mean, the number of people who still write to us every week wanting work experience, wanting trainee journalist jobs, even though the starting pay isn't great and the student debts can be high. There's still the appetite out there for people who want to do the job, and the newspaper groups now have to invest in them.
Terrific. Tim?
I've already described my ideal of hyperlocal, convergent multimedia journalism, and I believe passionately that it should exist. I very much hope that it'll be a hyperlocal, converged multimedia journalism which is supported by the generation from which most of the audience this evening appears to come. Support the news journalism that gives you the democratic choice to which you have become accustomed. Support journalism by recognising that it is truly a valuable contribution to public discourse, that it is something which contributes to the health of the public sphere, and that if it's going to need to survive, your generation needs to recognise that it's valuable. And I have to applaud, because there's been a spectacular newspaper success this year. It's called The Eye. It's run by The Independent. It was launched with the specific intention of being a high quality, cheap, 20 pence, compact quality newspaper aimed at people between the ages of 25 and 40. It is already selling more than 200,000 copies. I think that your generation shows enormous commitment to high quality journalism, and I'm very optimistic about the future. I simply hope that we will see the innovative news models, the innovative companies, which can bring that journalism back into contact with the communities it intends to serve.
Thank you. Finally.
I hope we're going to have a grown-up look at what news is all about and where it's going to come from and how it's going to be funded. I would like to think that Leveson inquiry will mature into something more than just looking at the ethics of a few newspapers in London. When you see the Prime Minister stand up in the Commons, along with Ed Miliband, and castigate the Press Complaints Commission for failing to stop a crime, which something it's not set up to. And if you're a regional newspaper editor, as I've been, as Steve is, as Johnny's over there, and Tim has been, then the PCC is an organisation that, quite frankly, has worked in our part of the industry, that no professional editor would ever want a PCC adjudication against him. We have to move this debate on to the grown-up one that looks at all aspects of the industry, how it's financed, the ethics that control the majority of newspapers in this country. And don't forget, there are 20 national newspapers, there are 1,180 local and regional newspapers still. So the regions in numerical terms have it by a long, long way. We've got to answer those questions: how consumers want their news, how their lifestyles have changed, how journalists can provide what they want, and how journalists can provide a service that will be funded, and that means that a service that will carry on scrutinising and making sure that authorities are held to account by people via their newspapers, by their local news organisations.
Well, you mentioned grown-up debate. I think we've had a grown-up debate here. Let's thank them. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you all for coming.